She prays in the courtroom, eyes wide open, lips moving in silent desperation, as if heaven, angels, God, any savior at all could rescue her from what's coming. Her lawyers had built what seemed like the perfect defense: a war refugee drowning in trauma, a child who fled bombings and family separation. She was just acting out, they claimed, too young to understand what she'd done. The defense was working, the judge was listening, but then the prosecution presented the autopsy photos, the confession recordings, and the timeline proved she'd been alone with her grandmother for hours, and everything changed. What you're about to see is the moment Sophia Kovville's childhood trauma defense collided with the brutal reality of what she did to her 80-year-old grandmother. The moment she understood that fleeing Ukraine couldn't erase what she did in that Lauderdale Lakes apartment. This is the chilling case of the teenage immigrant who beat her elderly grandmother to death. And every single detail I'm about to show you has been verified through court records, police reports, and sworn testimony. If you've never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Florida on May 23, 2024 will challenge everything you think you know about generational trauma, adolescent rage, and how a confiscated phone can trigger deadly violence. There was something investigators discovered about Sophia's behavior immediately after the killing, something that contradicted everything her defense would later claim about her mental state. The night began like any other in the quiet apartment complex off Northwest 41st Street. Vladimir Koval, a Ukrainian immigrant working hard to build a new life in Florida, had spent the evening visiting a friend. He left his 14-year-old daughter, Sofia, in the care of his mother, 80-year-old Yevenia. At approximately 12:15 a.m., Vladimir turned the key in his lock and stepped inside. The apartment was eerie, too quiet. Then he saw her. His mother, Yevenia, a woman who had survived the horrors of World War II and the modern-day bombings of Ukraine, was lying motionless on the living room floor. She wasn't just injured, the scene was one of extreme violence. Blood pooled around her gray hair. Her face was unrecognizable from bruising. Scattered across the floor were the broken remains of her medical walker, the very device she relied on to move. Beside her lay a leather belt, its heavy metal buckle stained red. Vladimir found his daughter, Sofia, in the nearby bedroom. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't performing CPR. She was making a strange, low, blubbering sound, a cry that felt disconnected from the carnage in the next room. When Vladimir asked the impossible question, "What happened?" the 14-year-old's response was chillingly clinical. "Grandma attacked me. I defended myself." Vladimir called 911 at 12:26 a.m. As paramedics rushed Yevenia to Broward Health Medical Center, the reality began to set in. She was pronounced dead on arrival. Under Florida's Baker Act, Sofia was taken for a psychiatric evaluation, but the investigation was only just beginning. When the 72-hour hold ended, she wasn't sent home to grieve. She was handcuffed and charged with murder. As investigators processed the crime scene, Sofia's self-defense story began to crumble under the weight of forensic evidence. The autopsy report was a roadmap of a sustained, brutal attack. Yevenia hadn't just been hit, she had been tortured. The medical examiner found blunt force trauma to the skull and deep, purple bruising across both of her arms, classic defensive wounds that proved the 80-year-old woman had held up her hands, begging for the blows to stop. But the most damning evidence was around her neck. Ligature marks consistent with strangulation showed that the leather belt found next to the body had been used to choke the life out of her. Detectives began to reconstruct the 4-hour window between 8 p.m. and midnight. They discovered the catalyst, a confiscated phone. Earlier that day, Vladimir had taken Sofia's phone away as punishment for behavioral issues. To a 14-year-old girl separated from her mother and her home country, that phone was her only lifeline. Without it, the darkness her father had seen building for months finally boiled over.
There were no witnesses, no security cameras, just a 14-year-old girl and her grandmother in a locked apartment. Sofia eventually admitted to the killing, but her story shifted like sand. First, it was self-defense. Then it was a mercy killing, claiming her grandmother was already dying and she simply helped her. But detectives noted something horrifying. In 3 hours of interrogation, Sofia never once asked if her grandmother was okay. She never asked if she was still alive. She showed no remorse, only a cold, blank stare. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in Lauderdale Lakes, you have to look back across the ocean to a history written in blood and survival. This apartment housed 2 people who had seen the worst of humanity, but they saw it through very different eyes. Yevenia Kovville was a woman defined by resilience. Born in 1944 in Nazi-occupied France, she entered the world in the middle of a global conflict. After the war, she moved to Soviet-controlled Ukraine, growing up under the iron fist of the Stalin regime. She lived through the Cold War, built a career as a teacher, and survived a grueling battle with cancer. For Yevenia, life was about endurance, discipline, and the strength to survive despite the odds. She moved to America in her 70s, hoping for a final chapter of peace. Then there was Sofia. Born in Ukraine in 2010, her childhood was stable until February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled across the border. At just 12 years old, Sofia's world was shattered by air raid sirens and the sound of falling bombs. While her father, Vladimir, stayed behind to help with evacuations, Sofia and her mother fled to Poland. The family was eventually torn apart by bureaucracy. Sofia's mother couldn't get a U.S. visa and had to stay in England, while Sofia and Vladimir moved to Florida in 2023. At 13, Sofia was dropped into a world where she didn't speak the language, had no friends, and was haunted by the trauma of war. Under the roof of that Florida apartment, these 2 worlds collided. To Yevenia, Sofia was a rebellious teenager who needed firm discipline, the kind of upbringing that had seen Yevenia through World War II. To Sofia, her grandmother's rules felt like another form of imprisonment, another war she couldn't escape. The tension grew in silence. At school, Sofia withdrew completely. At home, the only thing she cared about was the phone that connected her to her mother in Europe. Her father and grandmother saw it as an addiction. Sofia saw it as her only escape from a life she never chose. Weeks before the murder, there was a warning sign, a prelude to the violence. During an argument, Sofia had pulled a chair out from under Yevenia, causing the 80-year-old woman to fall and injure her hip. It was a flash of rage that the family hoped was just a phase. They couldn't afford therapy. They were immigrant workers living paycheck to paycheck. They didn't realize that inside Sofia, the childhood trauma wasn't a phase, it was a ticking bomb.
By September 2024, the quiet tragedy of the Koval family moved into the sterile, high-stakes environment of a Florida courtroom. 14-year-old Sophia Kovville sat at the defense table, facing a charge that carried the weight of a lifetime: first-degree murder. The central question before the judge wasn't whether Sofia had killed her grandmother. She had already admitted to that. The question was whether she should be tried as an adult or a juvenile. The defense team launched what many thought was a perfect defense. They painted a picture of a child broken by the machinery of war. They brought in psychologists who testified about Sofia's shattered psyche. They spoke of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the anxiety of family separation, and a dissociative state triggered by the confiscation of her phone. To the defense, Sofia hadn't committed a murder. She had suffered a psychological collapse. She was a victim of her circumstances, acting out a rage she couldn't understand. But the prosecution was ready with a counter-narrative that would chill the courtroom. They presented a court-appointed psychologist who had examined Sofia independently. His conclusion was devastating. Sofia understood exactly what she was doing. The prosecution argued that Sofia's behavior immediately following the attack showed a consciousness of guilt. They pointed to the fact that she changed her story 3 times. First, she claimed self-defense.
Then she claimed it was a mercy killing. Finally, she stopped talking altogether. That isn't mental illness, the prosecutor argued. That is calculation. The most powerful evidence, however, was the 4-hour window. The prosecution asked the court to imagine those 240 minutes. After the belt was tightened, after the walker was used as a weapon, Sofia didn't run for help. She didn't call 911. She didn't even try to stop the bleeding. She sat in the apartment, in the dark, next to her dying grandmother, and simply waited for her father to come home. The prosecution used Sofia's blank expression, the very thing the defense claimed was a sign of trauma, to prove she was a cold-blooded killer. They argued that she wasn't in a trance, she was simply indifferent. As the judge listened to the conflicting expert testimonies, the room remained silent, everyone waiting to see if the law would see a traumatized child or a dangerous adult. After 3 weeks of intense testimony, the courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the ruling. The community was divided. Was Sofia a monster in the making, or a child who could still be saved? The judge's decision was a complex middle ground. He ruled that Sofia Kovville's case would be transferred to juvenile court. She would not face life in prison as an adult. The defense won their motion, but the victory came with strings so tight they formed a legal cage. The judge imposed a maximum risk program. Sofia was sentenced to juvenile sanctions, including mandatory psychiatric treatment and intensive counseling. She was ordered to remain in a secure detention facility until she turned 18, but the court's oversight didn't end there. The court's warning: you could be in this program for up to 3 years and under supervision until you turn 21. If you fail to rehabilitate, if you show any violent behavior, or if you violate a single condition of your release, the state can petition to try you as an adult retroactively. The mercy Sofia received was not an acquittal, it was a deadline. She has until her 21st birthday to prove she is safe for society. If she fails, an adult prison cell and a murder conviction are still waiting for her. The most heartbreaking moment of the entire trial didn't come from the lawyers or the experts, it came from Yevenia Kovville. Standing in the courtroom where her daughter was being sentenced for killing her mother, Yevenia read a brief, shaky statement. He didn't ask her to come home. He didn't make excuses for her. He spoke as a man who had lost his past and his future in a single night. Yevenia's statement: "We lost our relationship. I am here today to testify that I hope this judgment will give a chance to my daughter to realize her mistake and correct her future life." He left the courtroom without looking at her. Today, Sofia remains in a Florida juvenile facility. Her life is a cycle of evaluations and therapy sessions. The case remains under strict supervision of the state, a constant reminder that the belt marks on Yevenia Kovville's neck are not forgotten. The story of Sofia Kovville serves as a chilling reminder of how the scars of war can travel across oceans and how a single moment of rage can destroy 3 generations of a family. Whether Sofia is a victim of her trauma or a calculated killer is a question that continues to haunt Lauderdale Lakes, and one that Sofia herself will have to answer through her actions over the next few years.